Hi, I'm Nick Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me today is Paul Fernandes, Chief of Staff of the Building and Construction Trades Council of Greater New York. Thank you for joining us today, Paul.
Thanks for having us.
I just wanted to jump right into the kind of one of the hot button issues of the moment is the scaffold law reform. So there's a big push now on the side of the reform advocates, running a lot of advertising. Is this a concern at all for the people on the other side of the issue, that there's this this big marketing push now?
Well, I don't know so much about whether the marketing push is a big concern, but the concern for us is what's at stake. And I think you almost need to take a step back and ask, why is this effort being made to reform the scaffold law? And when you really get down to it, it's not about the scaffold law at all. The thing that precipitates the focus on the scaffold law is a misguided notion that it's the scaffold law that is the reason that we have what we acknowledge is a general liability insurance problem in the state. General liability insurance is oftentimes too hard to come by. The coverage that's being provided is being reduced, and the price of the premiums that are being paid, by all reports, is increasing at a pretty precipitous rate. So when we look at that problem, we say, why is that happening? Opponents have said it's the scaffold law. Now, they've been saying that for more than a decade. What we've said is, let's actually take a look at the data, the fundamentals that drive insurance policy writing and premium pricing, and let's open up the books and see what's there, and then let's figure out what the real problem is and how it is that we solve it. But we don't believe that there's any real evidence that the scaffold law is the reason that we have this general liability insurance problem. People are saying that, but until you actually open up the data and conduct a real empirical analysis, you won't really know what the problem is. So that's what we're advocating. Open up the books and let's see where the facts lead us.
And Assemblyman Moya has introduced a bill to that effect that would open up the books. I mean, do you think that this bill has any hopes for moving its way through the legislature this session?
We think it does, because it makes sense. Whether it's us or even, quite frankly, the people that are on the other side of the issue who are confronting these problems in the insurance market, we would think that they would join us in supporting this legislation. We hope they would, because it would actually allow us to see why it is that the situation in the general liability insurance market is what it is. We would think everyone would want to see the facts laid bare so that we can then figure out how it is that we might solve some of the problems that are out there.
Workers' advocates have kind of characterized this fight as targeting minorities and immigrants, immigrant workers specifically. What would you say to these charges? I mean, is that off base? Is that is there some credence to that? What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that the debate has shifted into this realm. You have to understand that for literally more than 10 years, there's been a campaign to reform or repeal, or in our view, gut the scaffold law. And the arguments that have been made over that long period of time have thus far failed to bring about the change that opponents of the scaffold law want. So they introduced a new argument into the equation in the last year, which is that it affects minority and women-owned businesses, which, by the way, there's no evidence to support that argument. There's no empirical evidence that says that's true. There is one specific agency in the city, the School Construction Authority, that has a particular problem, but the reality is minority and women-owned businesses are actually doing quite well at a number of city and state agencies that don't have the same issue that confronts the School Construction Authority. And all accounts are that MWBE contracting opportunities are growing, not shrinking. However, since the MWBE argument was introduced into the debate, we've had to actually point to the fact that if there is a racial or ethnic dimension to workplace safety, it's not, in our view, MWBE concerns on this particular issue. The real issue is that, and all the OSHA statistics, a recent study from the Center for Popular Democracy, all the data that's available says that minority workers, particularly Latinos and new immigrants who don't speak English as their first language, are as much as 2 times more likely to die or be injured on a construction job site, and falls, the things that the scaffold law protects against, are one of the biggest causes of those fatalities and injuries. So our view is that if there's a minority or an ethnic component to the issue, it's that we need to really focus on, if anything, strengthening safety standards so that we can really get at this problem that confronts a predominantly minority and predominantly Latino workforce in ways that really outweigh their representation in the workforce. So if they represent, for example, Latinos, 40% of the construction workforce, yet they account for something like 3/4 of the fatalities, that's a clear indication that there's a problem.
The scaffold law was instituted in, I believe, the late 19th century. So there's no question this is a very old law. Are there aspects of the law that can be kind of upgraded, updated to reflect the evolving construction climate? I mean, you mentioned strengthening safety standards at a bare minimum. Is that kind of maybe a starting point for some reform talk?
Well, the only reason that we're really talking about the scaffold law is, again, this problem that exists in the general liability insurance market. Now, we don't believe the scaffold law has been shown to be the cause of those problems. So what we've said is, let's take a look at the data in the insurance industry, and then let's kind of let the facts take us where they may. With respect to the arguments against the scaffold law, the problem with the campaign against it is that almost every argument that they make on the law and the economics are provably false. They've been saying for more than a decade that the law holds contractors and owners liable even if they do everything right. Well, my opinion, it's not my opinion that that's the wrong interpretation of the law. The Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, has said very plainly that's not what the law says. The law says owners and contractors are only liable for these injuries or fatalities that result from work at heights if the owner or contractor has failed to provide the required safety protections that are in the statute. The other thing they've said is we're the only state in the country that has a scaffold law, as if that puts us at a competitive disadvantage. There was an article in the New York Law Journal last April that says that's actually not true, that there are other states that have scaffold laws, some of which are specifically inspired by New York statute, and some of which have court decisions that specifically cite New York as being the kind of the guiding, the place that guides how it is that they interpret their laws in different states around the country. And then the last thing they've said is if we get rid of the scaffold law, that we're going to see this huge increase in construction employment. The reality is, and they point to Illinois, which repealed its scaffold law in 1995. Well, the fact of the matter is that from 1995 to 2012, Illinois lost 35,000 construction jobs, while New York gained 60,000 construction jobs. So I think it's just a pretty bad example that you would want to point to. If Illinois is what you're kind of resting your argument on, that's really not the best case. And putting aside that saying the scaffold law is the sole driver of economic performance is just rather ridiculous. That's not true. New York right now actually has a pretty good construction outlook. Illinois actually does not have a very good economic outlook. Some reports that I've seen have said it's got the 50th worst economic climate in the country. So, we shouldn't be looking to other states that are doing worse than us to determine how it is that we move forward on important public policy concerns.
Now, actually, I'm glad you brought up the New York's construction outlook. It's fair to say that the Building and Construction Trades Council was somewhat of a beneficiary of Michael Bloomberg's pro-development agenda. There was obviously a ton of real estate projects going on over his 12 years. Mayor de Blasio, who's our new mayor, obviously has called for something of a fundamental reset with the development community. Does that concern you guys at all? Has there been dialogue with the new mayor as to what maybe he meant by that?
Well, I think we had a great relationship in some respects with the Bloomberg administration. In other areas, we just didn't agree. One of the areas that we didn't agree was some of the ways in which economic development and the development of affordable housing occurred. Too often, there were large amounts of public subsidies involved, but very little in the way of labor standards and assurances that good jobs would be created that provide the ability to raise a middle-class family for people who live in the city, that provided diverse opportunity for people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, not just that they get jobs, but that the jobs would be actually good. So when Mayor de Blasio talks about trying to change that element of how the city approaches public policy, we actually are encouraged. Now, the proof will be in the pudding. Will we actually see changes in how economic development and the development of housing proceeds in a way that assures that we actually are creating really good jobs for local residents from all the different communities of the city? That's something that we would certainly look forward to working with the new mayor on, but we'll have to see what happens.
And I want to shift gears a little bit and finish up. You were talking about how the building and construction trades has a lot of apprenticeship programs to increase diversity throughout all of the various construction trades. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I guess it's this is not your father's building trades. There's a lot of folks who remember the building trades in the 60s and 70s, maybe even the 80s, when it was predominantly a white workforce, white male. The reality is today that going back as far as the 2000 census, the majority of the construction workforce in New York City has been minority. In the unionized building trades, we see real increases in diversity and local opportunity in our apprenticeship system. So the apprenticeship system's where you come into the industry as new members. We train you at the industry's expense. You get classroom instruction, and you also get training on the job while you're working. We have about 8,000 apprentices in the city building trades apprenticeship system, and 6,000 of those apprentices live in the city, so 3/4 of our new members live in the city. That's great for local opportunity. And of those local residents, nearly 2/3 are members of minority communities, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and other minorities. So it's really just an indication that the unionized building trades have really changed a lot, that our membership really represents the diversity of the city. And I think that's important because when you talk about what we just discussed a little bit, changing the way that economic development occurs to benefit local residents, one of the important things is not just that we create jobs, but we create good career paths. And the apprenticeship training system is a great way to do that. It really assures that you're going to get paid good wages, you're going to have health insurance, you're going to have retirement security, and you're also going to get training in the skills that you need to work productively and to compete for long-term employment, as well as to work safely.
Paul Fernandes, Chief of Staff of the Building and Construction Trades Council of Greater New York, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.